Thrown out at 15, she built a tumbleweed igloo for nothing. Hjalmar Lindquist, who had survived 6 Nebraska winters, said, "A girl alone with a child, you'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." She had 43 cents, a 7-year-old brother, and needed shelter she could not build. On January 12, 1887, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 4 hours. But 5 months earlier, Nettie Graydon had never built anything larger than a chicken coop in her life. The wagon stopped at the edge of a half-section claim 12 miles south of Imperial, Nebraska, on a morning in late August 1886. Ezra Coombs set the brake and pointed toward a shape on the horizon, a dugout, half collapsed, a broken windmill, nothing else. "There," he said, "the Hendricks place. They quit last spring." Nettie climbed down. Her brother Thomas followed, 7 years old and silent. They had learned silence on the orphan train from New York, learned it again in Coombs's farmhouse, where silence meant survival. Coombs tossed their bundle into the dirt, a blanket, a cookpot, the clothes they wore. Everything else belonged to him, the tools, the food stores, the future they had been promised when the Children's Aid Society agent matched them to his household 14 months ago. "You're of age to file a claim," Coombs said. 15's head of household if you've got dependents." He nodded toward Thomas. "There's your dependent." The words were practical. The meaning was not. Coombs had taken them for labor. Nettie could cook, wash, mend, haul water, tend chickens, hoe corn. Thomas could gather chips, carry kindling, run errands. But Coombs's wife had died in June, and his attention had shifted. Nettie had seen that shift in other placements before. She knew what it meant. She had refused. She had kept refusing. And now they stood beside an abandoned claim with nothing but a blanket and a pot. "Winter comes in October out here," Coombs said. "Sometimes September. A girl and a child alone won't last a month." He gathered the reins. "When you change your mind, you know where to find me." The wagon pulled away. Nettie watched it shrink against the flat line of the earth until the dust settled and there was only grass, sky, and the wreckage of someone else's failure. Thomas tugged her sleeve. "Nettie, what do we do?" She didn't know. The dugout had been carved into a low rise, 3 walls of packed earth and one of sawed bricks. The roof had caved. The door hung from one leather hinge. Inside, she found what the Hendricks family had abandoned, a cast-iron stove too heavy to haul, 3 joints of rusted stovepipe, a broken chair, a pile of rotted sacking. Someone had scratched words into the sawed wall, "God help whoever comes next." Outside, the wind moved through the grass in waves. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles east, a Norwegian family named Lindquist that Coombs had mentioned once. Imperial, the new county seat, sat 12 miles north. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a land office. No railroad. The railroad wouldn't arrive for 6 more years. Nettie counted what she had. 43 cents in a cloth purse, a 7-year-old brother, a collapsed dugout, no tools, no food, no fuel, no walls, and 8 weeks perhaps until the first hard freeze. She walked the quarter section that afternoon while Thomas sat in the shade of the broken windmill. The grass ran waist-high in places, stirred by a wind that never stopped. She found the well dry, the rope rotted away. She found the remains of a garden plot, choked with weeds. She found the outline of where a sod house had been started and abandoned, the bricks already crumbling back into the earth. And she found the tumbleweeds. They piled against the eastern fence line in drifts taller than her head, dried Russian thistle, brown and skeletal, tangled into masses dense as haystacks. Coombs had cursed them constantly. They blew into his fields, caught in his fences, clogged his well mechanism. A single plant, he said, dropped 200,000 seeds. They were worthless, worse than worthless. A plague that had come with the German Russians a dozen years back and spread faster than any weed anyone had seen. Nettie pulled a tumbleweed from the pile. It was light, almost weightless, but dense with branching stems that interlocked like woven wire. The thorns pricked her palms. She pushed her hand into the center of the mass. Dry. Still. The wind couldn't reach through all those tangled branches. She didn't have a thought yet, just a sensation. Something about the way the air stopped moving inside that thorny cage. 3 days later, Hjalmar Lindquist rode up to the dugout on a plow horse. He was 60 years old, barrel-chested, with a beard that reached his collar. He'd homesteaded in Nebraska since 1880, survived 6 winters, buried a son and a daughter-in-law to diphtheria. When he spoke, his accent still carried the cadence of Trondheim. He looked at the collapsed roof. He looked at the stove Nettie had dragged into the open. He looked at Thomas, who was stacking cow chips into a pyramid beside the windmill. "Coombs told me you were here," Lindquist said. "Said you'd be dead by November." "Coombs says a lot of things. He's not wrong about winter." Lindquist dismounted and walked the perimeter of the dugout. "You can't repair this. The sod's rotted through. You'd need to cut new bricks, 1,000 at least, each one 50 pounds. Hauling them alone would take you 3 weeks. You don't have 3 weeks." "I know." "Do you?" He faced her directly. "I've seen what happens to people who don't prepare. 1880 was the first bad winter. Snow came in October and didn't stop until May. We ate seed grain by February. The Andersons, 2 claims south of me, they burned their furniture, then their fencing, then their barn. Still froze. All 3 of them, stiff as fence posts with their cattle dead around them." He paused. "A woman alone can't cut enough timber, and there isn't timber to cut anyway. A girl alone, with a child." He shook his head. "You'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." Nettie felt the words land. They were true. She knew they were true. The numbers didn't work. A homesteader needed 3 to 5 cords of fuel for winter, and fuel on the treeless plains meant twisted hay, corn cobs, or buffalo chips, and the buffalo were gone. She had no hay, no corn, no cattle, nothing but the chips Thomas gathered and the wind that blew through the broken dugout walls. "Come work for me," Lindquist said. "I need help. My wife can't manage the house alone anymore. You'd have food, shelter, wages. The boy too. As servants. As household help." It was the same thing. Nettie had been household help since the orphan train dropped her in Nebraska. Household help meant sleeping in a lean-to, eating last, working first, depending entirely on the goodwill of people who owed her nothing. "I'll file a claim," she said. "This quarter section. The Hendricks abandoned it, so the title's clear. I'm 15 and head of household. The law allows it." "The law allows it. Winter doesn't." Lindquist mounted his horse. "You have 2 months, maybe less. When the cold comes, you'll have no walls, no fuel, no food stores. Coombs thinks you'll crawl back to him. I think you'll die out here trying to prove you won't." He looked at Thomas, then back at her. "That boy didn't choose this. Don't kill him for your pride." He rode east. Nettie watched until he disappeared into the grass. Thomas came to stand beside her. "Are we going to die?" "No." "How do you know?" She didn't, but she couldn't say that. So she said nothing, and they stood together in the wind while the sun moved west and the shadows grew long across the ruined dugout. The idea came 3 days later, in the hour before dawn. Nettie couldn't sleep. The August nights were warm, But she lay awake calculating, always calculating. 43 cents wouldn't buy a winter's worth of anything. She had no tools to cut sod, no team to haul it, no time to build the 1,000 brick walls that a proper soddy required. The dugout's earthen walls provided some shelter, but the collapsed roof exposed them to sky. When the rain came, they'd be soaked. When the snow came, they'd be buried. She thought about the Wichita grass houses she'd heard described, domed structures thatched with prairie grass, built by the tribes who had lived here before the settlers came. She'd seen a drawing in a book once at the schoolhouse in Coombs's township. Great beehive shapes covered in thick bundles of blue stem, waterproof and windproof. The article said they lasted for decades, but thatching required grass cut at the right season, dried properly, bundled and layered with skill she didn't have. It required poles, cedar, or willow, driven into the ground and bent to form the frame, and it required time, weeks of careful labor. She didn't have weeks. She had maybe 6 before the first frost, maybe 8 before the killing cold. She lay in the broken dugout and listened to Thomas breathe. The wind pushed through the gaps in the sod walls, carrying the dry rattle of tumbleweeds shifting against the fence line. That sound, the scrape of thorn against thorn, the whisper of dead branches tangling, had become the background noise of her nights. And then, for the first time, she actually listened to it. The tumbleweeds didn't blow away. They caught against each other, interlocked, formed masses that the wind couldn't shift. Dense masses. She'd pushed her hand into one and found still air at the center, dead air, trapped by the maze of thorny branches. Still air didn't move. An air that didn't move didn't carry heat away. She sat up in the darkness. A sod house worked because the thick earth walls absorbed heat and blocked wind. But sod was heavy. Each brick weighed 50 pounds. She couldn't lift 50 pounds 1,000 times. She was 15, and her arms were already aching from hauling water and gathering chips. But tumbleweeds weighed nothing. A mass the size of a hay bale weighed less than 10 pounds. She could carry them. She could compress them. And if she packed them tight enough that the air inside couldn't circulate, they would insulate. The idea was absurd. She knew it was absurd. Tumbleweeds were a nuisance, a pest, the most worthless thing on the plains. No one used them for anything. They burned too fast for fuel, crumbled too easily for fencing, served no purpose except to spread their seeds across every plowed field in the territory. But she had thousands of them piled against her fence line for free. She had nothing else. By dawn, she had a plan. Watchie, she walked to the Lindquist homestead that morning and asked to borrow a spade. Hjalmar's wife, Ingrid, looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. A spade? For what? Digging. I want to excavate the floor of the dugout another 2 feet, put the living space below ground level. Below ground? Ingrid frowned. The floor will flood when the rain comes. I'll grade it for drainage, slope it toward a seep hole in the corner. Ingrid studied her for a long moment. Then she disappeared into the sod house and returned with a spade, worn but solid. My son's, she said. He won't be needing it anymore. Nettie took the spade. Thank you. What else? Nettie hesitated. This was the part that would sound mad. Do you have any chicken wire, or know where I could get some? Chicken wire? Poultry netting, the hexagonal kind. Ingrid's frown deepened. The store in Imperial has some, 50 cents a roll, maybe more. What do you want chicken wire for? Building. Building what? Nettie didn't answer. She thanked Ingrid again and walked home with the spade over her shoulder. Her 43 cents wouldn't buy a full roll of wire, but maybe she could trade labor. Maybe she could find someone who had scrap. She started digging that afternoon. The earth was hard-packed, baked by summer sun. Each spadeful took 3 strikes to loosen. Thomas helped when he could, carrying the loose dirt in the cookpot and dumping it outside the dugout's entrance. By sunset, they had excavated 6 inches. Nettie's palms blistered, broke, bled. She wrapped them in strips torn from the blanket and kept digging. 3 days later, the floor was 18 inches lower. The air at the bottom felt cooler, damper, earth temperature, stable, regardless of the weather above. On the 4th day, Alma Paulson appeared. Alma was 32, a widow with a claim 3 miles southwest. Her husband had died the previous winter from a fever that started as a cough and ended in a grave she dug herself because the ground was too frozen for anyone else to help. She kept chickens, sold eggs to the store in Imperial, and minded her own business with a ferocity that the other settlers had learned to respect. She rode up on a mule and sat there for a long time, watching Nettie dig. "Lindquist told me about you," she finally said. "Said you were either stubborn or stupid, and he couldn't tell which." Nettie leaned on the spade. "Did he send you to talk me out of it?" "He asked me to. I told him I'd come look for myself." Alma dismounted and walked to the edge of the excavation. "This is good work. Lower in the floor. It'll help with heat retention." "You know about building." "I know my husband couldn't build worth a damn, and our first winter nearly killed us both because of it. I learned fast." She looked at the collapsed roof, the crumbling walls. "You can't repair these sod bricks. They've had too much water damage. The grass roots are dead." "I know. I'm not going to repair them." "Then what?" Nettie pointed toward the fence line. "Tumbleweeds." Alma stared at her. Then she stared at the fence line, then back at Nettie. "Tumbleweeds." "Compressed between layers of chicken wire, packed tight enough to trap the air, like straw banking, but all the way around." "Tumbleweeds are a fire hazard. One spark from that stove and the whole thing goes up. Only if they're loose. Compressed material doesn't burn the same way. There's no air to feed the flame." Alma shook her head slowly. "You're building a house out of weeds and wire. I'm building shelter out of what I have." "Girl, I've lived on these plains for 5 years. I've seen a lot of people try a lot of things. Half of them are dead now. The ones who survived did it by doing what works: sod houses, dugouts, proper construction. Not," she gestured at the tumbleweed pile. "Not this. Sod houses leak. They collapse. Snakes live in the walls. And I can't cut enough sod alone anyway." "Then get help. There's a man in Imperial who builds soddies for hire. $10 for a basic house. You can work off the debt." "I don't have $10. I have 43 cents. Alma fell silent. She looked at Thomas, who was sitting by the windmill with his back against the broken frame, watching them. "That your brother?" "Yes." "How old?" "7. Another long silence. When Alma spoke again, her voice had changed, still skeptical, but something else underneath. Something that might have been respect, or might have been pity. "You're going to pack tumbleweeds into a dome and hope it keeps you alive through a Nebraska winter." "Yes." "It won't work." "Maybe not." "Probably not." Nettie picked up the spade. "Probably not," she agreed. "But I'm going to try anyway." Alma mounted her mule and gathered the reins. "I have some chicken wire," she said. "Scrap pieces left over from the coop. Not enough for whatever you're planning, but some. I'll bring it by tomorrow." "Why?" Alma looked at her for a long moment. "Because I remember what it felt like to have nothing and need everything. And because if you die out here, I don't want to be the one who could have helped and didn't." She turned the mule east. "But I still think you're going to freeze." September came, and with it, the first cool nights. Nettie worked from dawn until she couldn't see her hands in front of her face. The dugout floor now sat 3 feet below ground level, the earth walls rising around a rectangular pit 12 feet by 8. She had salvaged the sound portions of the old sod walls and stacked them into a low barrier around the pit's edge, not tall enough to form walls, but enough to anchor what came next. The chicken wire had cost her everything. Alma's scraps helped, but she needed more. 4 rolls to do it right, enough to create an inner and outer layer with space between for the tumbleweeds. She walked to Imperial and back, 12 miles each way, and offered to work for the general store owner in exchange for wire. He gave her 2 rolls in trade for a week's labor, sweeping, stocking shelves, hauling freight from the supply wagons that came up from the railroad terminus in Culbertson. While she worked in Imperial, Thomas stayed with the Lindquists. Ingrid fed him, though Hjalmar still shook his head every time Nettie came to collect her brother. "You're wasting time," Hjalmar said on the day she finished her labor and headed home with the wire rolls on her back. "Every day you spend on this foolishness is a day you're not preparing properly. You have no fuel stores, no food preserved. No? I have a plan for fuel." "What plan?" "Twisted hay, cow chips, the same as everyone else. You have no hay, you have no cattle. I'll gather prairie grass. There's plenty of it. Gathering enough grass for a winter takes a full-grown man weeks. You're a girl. Alone. With a child." Nettie shifted the wire rolls on her shoulders. They dug into her collarbone, already raw from the walk. "Then I'll work faster." Hjalmar said something in Norwegian that she couldn't understand. It didn't sound like a blessing. Back at the claim, she began constructing the frame. The frame was the hardest part. She needed flexible poles, willow or cottonwood, long enough to bend into an arch, and strong enough to hold shape under the weight of compressed tumbleweeds. The nearest stand of willows grew along the Republican River, 8 miles south. She made the walk twice, cutting armloads of green branches with the pocket knife she'd kept hidden from Coombs, hauling them back in bundles lashed to her shoulders. Her hands cramped from gripping the knife. Her shoulders ached from the weight. She lost 3 pounds the first week, then 4 more the second. Thomas watched her with worried eyes, but didn't ask questions anymore. He understood, in the way children understand things they're too young to name. This was survival, and survival meant silence and work and nothing else. She drove the willow poles into the ground at 2-foot intervals around the perimeter of the excavated pit, forming a rough oval 14 feet long and 10 feet wide. Then she bent them inward, 1 pair at a time, lashing the tops together with strips of wet rawhide that would shrink and tighten as they dried. The frame rose in a series of overlapping arches, each one supporting the next, until she had a dome-shaped skeleton 8 feet high at its peak. The chicken wire came next. She wrapped the outer layer first, stapling it to the willow poles with nails bent into U-shapes, a technique she invented after ruining her first 3 attempts. The wire sagged in places, bunched in others, but it held. Then she began packing the tumbleweeds. Each weed had to be compressed by hand, the branching stems forced together until the mass was dense enough to resist the wind. She wore strips of blanket around her palms to protect against the thorns, but the thorns found gaps. By the end of the first day, her hands looked like she'd been fighting a cat. By the end of the first week, the cuts had scabbed over and split open so many times that she stopped feeling them. She packed the tumbleweeds between the outer wire layer and the inner one. She erected a foot inside it, creating a shell of compressed plant material 12 inches thick. The dome grew darker as the layers thickened, less light filtering through, more protection from the wind. She sealed the gaps where the wire met the sod foundation with mud mixed from clay dug near the dry well. The mud dried and cracked. She applied more mud. It cracked again. On the 14th of September, Ezra Coombs came back. He rode up in the late afternoon with two other men, land speculators from Culbertson who had been buying up abandoned claims and flipping them to late-arriving settlers. Nettie recognized them from the general store in Imperial. They had a reputation for sharp dealing and shorter patience. Coombs dismounted and walked around the half-finished dome. He didn't touch anything. He just looked, his face unreadable. "Well," he said finally, "this is something. It's shelter. It's a pile of weeds." He gestured at the tumbleweeds packed into the wire frame. "You're building a house out of the worst pest on the plains. You know what happens when this catches fire? The whole thing goes up in 30 seconds. A single ember from your stove, a lightning strike, a knocked-over lantern." He snapped his fingers. "Gone. It won't catch fire. Everything catches fire. Not compressed material. The air can't circulate. Without air, there's no flame." Coombs laughed. The sound had no warmth in it. "You've been reading books. That's your problem. Books don't tell you what happens when the real cold comes, when it's 40 below and the wind is blowing 60 miles an hour and the snow is so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. Books don't tell you what it sounds like when a child freezes to death." Thomas was inside the dome, arranging the bedding they had made from prairie grass stuffed into grain sacks. Nettie moved to block Coombs's line of sight. "What do you want?" Coombs nodded toward the speculators. "Mr. Gentry and Mr. Pike want to buy this quarter section. They'll give you $12 for your quitclaim. That's more than fair for land you haven't proved up." "I'm not selling." "You haven't filed yet. I checked at the land office. You're squatting on an abandoned claim. Anyone can file on it." "I'm filing next week." "With what money?" "The filing fee is $14. Nettie felt her stomach drop. She hadn't known about the fee. Coombs saw it in her face. $14, he repeated. "Which you don't have, and won't have, and can't earn in time because winter's coming and you're going to spend every hour between now and November trying not to die." He stepped closer. "Take the $12. Walk to Imperial. Buy a ticket on the freight wagon to Culbertson, then take the train somewhere warm. Start over somewhere that won't kill you." "And Thomas?" "The boy can come back to me. He's too young for the train alone anyway. I'll place him with another family. The Children's Aid has agents in Culbertson." "You'll sell him. That's what you do with orphan train children. Trade them like livestock until someone pays enough." Coombs's expression hardened. "I'm offering you a way out. Take it." "No." "Then freeze." He remounted and gathered his reins. "When I file on this claim in January, I'll make sure they bury you proper. If there's anything left to bury." He rode away with the speculators. Nettie watched until they were gone, then sat down in the grass and put her head in her hands. $14. She had 31 cents left after buying nails in Imperial. 31 cents against $14. Against winter. Against Coombs. Against everyone who said she would fail. Thomas came out of the dome and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He just leaned against her shoulder, small and warm and trusting. "Nettie?" he said after a while. "Yes?" "The dome is darker inside now. It feels warmer, too." She lifted her head. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of red and gold. The half-finished dome rose behind them, its compressed tumbleweed walls golden in the evening light. "We're not done yet," she said. "I know, but it's starting to work." She looked at the dome, at the work already finished, at the weeks of labor still ahead. "Yes," she said, "it's starting to work." But starting wasn't finishing, and winter was coming fast. October arrived with frost on the ground and a bite in the wind. Nettie had worked without pause for 37 days. The dome was finished, walls complete, roof sealed with a thick layer of mud and prairie grass. A small opening on the eastern side fitted with a frame of willow poles that she could block with a blanket. The stove sat in the center, its pipe rising through a mud-lined hole in the apex of the dome. She had packed extra tumbleweeds around the base, creating a barrier 3 feet thick where the walls met the ground. Her body showed the cost. She had lost 11 pounds since August. Her hands were a map of scabs and calluses. Her shoulders ached constantly from hauling water, wire, mud, and tumbleweeds. At night, she dreamed of warm rooms and full plates, and woke to find Thomas curled against her, shivering in his sleep. But the dome stood, and inside, the air was still. Alma Paulson came to see it on the 3rd of October. She walked through the blanket-covered entrance and stood in the dim interior for a long time without speaking. "It's warm," she finally said. "Warmer than outside." "Much warmer." Alma pressed her hand against the compressed tumbleweed wall. "I didn't believe it would work. I told Lindquist you were going to build a fire trap. He agreed with me." "What do you think now?" Alma turned in a slow circle, looking at the packed walls, the sealed roof, the stove waiting to be lit. "I think the first real test will come when the temperature drops below 0. This," she gestured at the dome, "might hold heat when it's 30 degrees outside. It might even hold heat when it's 10 degrees outside. But when it's 20 below and the wind is blowing hard, everything changes. The cold finds every gap, every crack, every thin spot you didn't notice." "I know." "Do you?" Nettie showed her the mud seals, the extra layers of compressed tumbleweed at the joints, the insulated stovepipe collar that she had designed from scrap tin and clay. Alma looked at everything. Then she looked at Nettie. "I have something for you," she said. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I went to the land office yesterday, told them I was filing on behalf of a minor who qualified as head of household. They made me sign as your guarantor." Nettie unfolded the paper. It was a homestead claim stamped and registered. Her name, this quarter section. Official. "The fee." "I paid it, $14. Alma held up her hand before Nettie could speak. "Don't thank me yet. You can pay me back when you prove up in 3 years. If you're still alive." Nettie stared at the paper. Her hands shook. She couldn't speak. "Coombs came to see me," Alma said. "Told me I was wasting my money. Told me you'd be dead by Christmas and I'd never see a cent of it back." She paused. "I told him to go to hell." Thomas made a small sound, halfway between a laugh and a gasp. He had never heard a woman curse before. Alma smiled thinly. "You're not out of danger. Not even close. You have no fuel stores worth mentioning, no food beyond what you've been foraging, and winter hasn't truly arrived yet. The real test is still coming." She walked toward the entrance, then stopped and looked back. "But you've done more with nothing than I thought was possible. And if that dome holds heat the way it seems like it might," she shook her head. "Well, we'll see." She ducked through the entrance and was gone. Nettie sat down on the packed earth floor, the homestead claim clutched in her hands. The paper was rough, the ink official, the words more valuable than anything she owned. She was a homesteader. She had a claim. Now she just had to survive long enough to keep it. The temperature dropped 12 degrees overnight on October 9th. Nettie woke to find her breath visible in the dome's interior, the walls cold against her fingertips. She lit the stove for the first time. The fire caught slowly, twisted grass and dried cow chips, the only fuel she had. Smoke rose through the pipe, and for a terrifying moment she thought the tumbleweeds would ignite, the whole dome erupting into flame the way Coombs had predicted. But the walls didn't burn. The compressed material was too dense, too tightly packed. The heat from the stove radiated outward, met the insulating barrier, and stayed. Within an hour, the dome's interior had warmed to the point where Thomas shed his coat. Within 2 hours, Nettie had to crack the entrance blanket to let cooler air inside. It was working, but the fuel was disappearing fast. She'd gathered enough twisted hay and cow chips for perhaps 2 weeks of fires. Winter would last 5 months. She left Thomas in the dome and walked 12 miles to Imperial. The general store owner shook his head when she asked about fuel. Coal's $5 a ton, and you'd need 3 tons minimum for a winter. Cordwood's $7 a cord, and the nearest supply is 60 miles east. You don't have the money or the transport? What about work? I'll work for fuel. I don't have enough fuel to pay in kind. Nobody does. Everyone's short this year. She walked home in the dark, stumbling over the uneven prairie, arriving at the dome after midnight. Thomas was asleep. The stove had gone cold. She sat in the darkness and did the math again. 31 cents. No fuel. No food stores. 8 weeks until the worst of winter. The numbers didn't work. They had never worked. And now, with the temperature dropping and the first snows threatening, she was running out of time to change them. But she had a dome that held heat, a claim that was legally hers, a brother who trusted her to keep him alive. She would find a way. She had to find a way. She just didn't know what that way was yet. The first snow came on October 15th. It fell gently, fat, wet flakes that melted when they touched the ground, but Nettie knew what it meant. The season had turned. The window for preparation was closing. She spent the next 3 days ranging across the prairie, gathering every scrap of burnable material she could find: dried sunflower stalks, dead grass twisted into knots, cow chips from the Lindquists' pasture with Ingrid's grudging permission, corn cobs scattered from a failed crop 2 miles north. She piled everything inside the dome until there was barely room to move. It still wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. The fuel burned too fast, 30 minutes of heat for an hour's work gathering. On the 18th of October, she woke to find the world white. 3 inches of snow covered the ground. More was falling. The temperature stood at 12 degrees, cold enough to freeze water, cold enough to kill an unprepared person in hours. Inside the dome, with the stove burning, the temperature held at 46 degrees. Nettie tested the walls again, pressing her palm against the compressed tumbleweeds. Cool, but not cold. The dead air trapped in those thorny branches was doing exactly what she had hoped, slowing the transfer of heat, keeping the warmth inside. But the fuel was going faster than she had calculated. 2 bushels of chips for 8 hours of heat. She had maybe 50 bushels. 10 days if she was careful. 12 if she let the fire die during the daylight hours. Winter would last 5 months. She needed a miracle. Or she needed to find more fuel than existed on this empty stretch of prairie. Or she stopped, looked at the walls of the dome. The compressed tumbleweeds packed layer upon layer, thick and dense and utterly useless for burning. Except that wasn't quite true, was it? The tumbleweeds themselves couldn't burn safely. They were her walls, her insulation, the only thing standing between her family and the killing cold. But there were more tumbleweeds, thousands more, drifted against every fence line, every abandoned claim, every low spot in the terrain for miles around, and the dead air that made them useless for burning made them perfect for something else. Heat didn't need to come from fire. Heat could come from bodies, from breath, from activity, from the slow decay of organic material packed in an enclosed space. Farmers knew this. That was why root cellars stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. That was why haystacks didn't freeze solid. That was why a barn full of cattle stayed warmer than an empty barn, even without a fire. she couldn't burn the tumbleweeds. But maybe she didn't need to. What if she could use the dome's insulation to trap every scrap of heat she and Thomas generated? What if she could seal it so tightly that their own bodies warmed the space? The dome was small, less than 120 square feet of floor space. Two bodies, breathing and moving and sleeping, produced heat. A small fire for cooking only, not for constant heating. And the walls, those beautiful, useless, thorn-covered walls, would hold it all inside. She began sealing every gap she could find, every crack in the mud, every thin spot in the tumbleweed packing, every whisper of cold air that meant heat escaping. She stuffed dried grass into the spaces around the entrance. She banked more compressed tumbleweeds against the exterior, creating a wall of insulation 2 feet thick at the base. By sunset, the dome was darker than ever, sealed so tight that lighting a single candle made the air feel close. By midnight, with the stove cold and the entrance sealed, the interior temperature held at 38 degrees. Outside, it was 19. 38 degrees wouldn't feel warm, but it wouldn't kill them. And with the fire burning only for cooking, an hour in the morning, an hour at night, the fuel might last. She had bought herself time, not much, but some, and time was all she needed. Because winter hadn't truly arrived yet. The real test was still coming, and the real test was coming fast. November passed in a blur of cold and careful rationing. The dome held. That was the miracle Nettie hadn't dared to believe in. Day after day, night after night, the compressed tumbleweed walls kept the interior temperature stable. Outside, the thermometer at the Lindquist farm dropped to 8 degrees, then 4, then 12 below zero on the morning of November 22nd. Inside the dome, with the entrance sealed and two bodies breathing in the darkness, the temperature never fell below 31 degrees. It wasn't warm. Nettie and Thomas slept in all their clothes, huddled together under the blanket and the makeshift quilt she had sewn from grain sacks stuffed with prairie grass. Their breath fogged in the air. The water bucket grew a skin of ice overnight, but they didn't freeze. They didn't even come close. She lit the stove twice a day, an hour in the morning to cook breakfast and warm the space to 50 degrees, an hour in the evening to cook supper and heat water for washing. The fuel lasted longer than she had calculated. By the end of November, she still had 30 bushels of chips and hay remaining, enough for another month, maybe 6 weeks. The food was harder. She had foraged everything she could find before the snow covered the prairie. Dried rose hips, the last of the wild turnips, seeds from sunflowers, and lamb's quarters. She had traded 2 days' labor at the Lindquist farm for 10 pounds of cornmeal and 5 pounds of dried beans. She had walked to Imperial and bought salt, lard, and a small bag of flour with the 31 cents that remained after buying nails. It wasn't enough for a winter. She knew it wasn't enough. But rationed carefully a cup of cornmeal mush in the morning, a thin soup of beans, and whatever roots she could dig from under the snow in the evening. It might last until February. After that, she would figure something out. She had to believe she would figure something out. Hjalmar Lindquist came to check on them in early December. He stood inside the dome for a long time, saying nothing. The temperature outside was 6 degrees. Inside, with the stove cold and the entrance sealed, it was 34. Nettie watched him press his palm against the tumbleweed wall, the same way Alma had done 2 months before. "It's working," he finally said. "Yes." "I didn't think it would." "I know." He turned to face her. His expression had changed, not friendly exactly, but no longer dismissive. "The worst hasn't come yet. January and February are harder than November. The cold goes deeper. The storms last longer. The fuel runs out faster because you can't gather more." He paused. "But this, what you've built here, it might hold. Might? Might? The real test is still coming. He ducked through the entrance and paused outside, looking back. I have hay I can spare. Not much, a wagon load, maybe two. The cattle need most of it, but if you can haul it yourself, you can have what's left over. I'll haul it. Tomorrow, before the weather turns. She hauled it the next day, making 3 trips with a makeshift sled she built from salvaged boards and rope. The hay filled one corner of the dome, enough fuel for another month, maybe more. Her shoulders ached. Her hands bled through the rags she wrapped them in. But when she collapsed onto the bedding that night, she felt something she hadn't felt since August. Hope. December 23rd brought the first real blizzard. It came from the northwest, a wall of white that swallowed the horizon in minutes. Nettie saw it building that morning, a dark line on the edge of the sky, growing taller and closer with unnatural speed. By noon, the wind had risen to a howl. By 3 o'clock, she couldn't see the broken windmill 50 feet from the dome's entrance. She sealed everything. The entrance blanket weighted with stones, the gaps around the stovepipe stuffed with grass, the banked tumbleweeds piled higher against the exterior walls, creating a drift she hoped would insulate rather than bury them. The storm lasted 2 days. Inside the dome, the wind was a distant roar, present but muffled, the way a train sounds from a mile away. The walls flexed slightly under the pressure, the chicken wire creaking against the willow poles, but they held. Snow accumulated against the eastern face, adding another layer of insulation. The interior temperature dropped to 28 degrees on the first night, rose to 36 when she lit the stove the next morning, and stabilized at 32 when the fire died. On the second night, Thomas started coughing. It was a small cough at first, the kind that comes with dry air and cold rooms. Nettie gave him warm water with a spoonful of hoarded honey and told him to sleep. But by morning, the cough had deepened. By evening, his forehead was hot to the touch. Fever. On the plains in winter, fever killed. She kept the stove burning through the night, burning through the fuel faster than she had planned. She boiled water and made him breathe the steam. She wrapped him in every scrap of cloth she had and held him against her body, trying to share her warmth. The storm ended on Christmas morning. She dug out through the snow that had drifted against the entrance and found a world transformed, white and silent and utterly still. The temperature stood at 11 degrees below zero. Thomas's fever hadn't broken. She couldn't take him to a doctor. The nearest doctor was in Culbertson, 60 miles east. Walking that distance in winter carrying a sick child would kill them both. She couldn't leave him alone to go for help. She couldn't do anything except what she was already doing, keeping him warm, keeping him hydrated, keeping the dome sealed against the cold that would kill him faster than any sickness. For 3 days, she didn't sleep. She sat beside him, feeding the stove, boiling water, listening to his breath rattle in his chest. She talked to him about things she remembered from before, their mother's face, the sound of their father's voice, the apartment in New York where they had lived before the orphan train. She didn't know if he could hear her. She talked anyway. On the morning of December 28th, his fever broke. She knew it the moment she touched his forehead, cooler, damp with clean sweat instead of the dry heat of infection. He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in days. Nettie, I'm hungry. She made him cornmeal mush with the last of the honey. He ate half and fell asleep again, but it was real sleep this time, deep and steady, his breathing clear. She sat beside the cold stove, too exhausted to cry, and counted what remained. 12 bushels of chips and hay, 3 pounds of cornmeal, a handful of dried beans. January hadn't even arrived, but Thomas was alive. The dome had held, and she was still here, still fighting, still refusing to die the way everyone had predicted. The real test, she realized, wasn't the blizzard. The real test was everything after. January brought the cold that kills. The temperature dropped to 26 below zero on the 3rd of January, 1887. Nettie knew because Hjalmar Lindquist told her later. His thermometer froze at 20 below and wouldn't register anything colder. She felt it in the dome as a different quality of air, not just cold, but heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. The walls of compressed tumbleweeds contracted slightly, the frozen plant material shrinking in the grip of temperatures it had never been designed to withstand. Ice formed on the interior surface where her breath condensed against the outer layer. The mud seals cracked and needed constant repair, but the interior temperature held at 24 degrees, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough to keep the water bucket frozen, but not cold enough to kill. She burned fuel constantly now. The rationing had ended when Thomas got sick. She couldn't let the temperature drop below freezing while his body fought the infection. Her stores shrank from 12 bushels to 8, from 8 to 5, from 5 to 3. She started burning the bedding straw, then the grass stuffed into her makeshift quilts, then the frame of the broken chair she had salvaged from the original dugout. On January the 7th, she burned the last of the twisted hay. She had nothing left except the tumbleweeds, the walls themselves, the only things standing between her family and the killing cold. She couldn't burn those. If she burned the walls, they would die before the fire went out. She sealed the stove and didn't light it again. For 3 days, they survived on body heat alone. She and Thomas huddled together under every scrap of cloth they owned, breathing slowly to conserve warmth, moving only to drink water melted from snow packed into the cookpot and held against their bodies until it liquefied. The interior temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Frost formed on their blankets. Their water froze before they could drink it. On the evening of January 10th, Alma Paulson appeared at the entrance. She was hauling a sled loaded with hay, good hay, the kind farmers reserved for their best horses. Her face was raw from the cold, her hands wrapped in rags that had frozen stiff. "I came to see if you were dead," she said. "You're not. That's something." Nettie couldn't speak. Her lips were too cold to form words. Alma pushed past her and looked around the dome, at the empty stove, at the frost on the walls, at Thomas, barely visible under the pile of frozen cloth. "Jesus," she whispered. She lit the stove herself, feeding it with hay from her sled until the flames roared and heat began to spread through the dome. She boiled water and made Nettie drink it. She checked Thomas's pulse and breathing and pronounced him weak but alive. "You nearly died," she said. "Another day, maybe 2, and I would have found corpses." "I know." "Then why didn't you come to us? To the Lindquists? To anyone?" "I couldn't leave Thomas, and I couldn't carry him." Alma stared at her for a long moment. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. "You stubborn, stupid, magnificent fool. You would rather freeze to death than ask for help." "I didn't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Alma's voice rose. "You're 15 years old. You built a house out of weeds. You kept yourself and a child alive through conditions that killed grown men with proper supplies. You're not a burden. You're—" She stopped, shook her head. "I don't know what you are, but you're not a burden." She stayed through the night, keeping the stove fed while Nettie slept for the first time in days. In the morning, she left more hay, 2 sled loads, enough for 3 weeks, and instructions to come to her farm if things got worse. "I mean it," she said. "If you run out again, you come to me. Don't sit here waiting to die. That's not strength, that's pride, and pride will kill you faster than the cold." Nettie nodded. She meant it. She would go if she had to. but she hoped she wouldn't have to. Yes, the real test came on January 12th. Nettie woke that morning to stillness. The wind that had been blowing steadily for weeks had stopped. The air outside the dome felt strange, heavy, and waiting, the way the sky felt before a summer thunderstorm. The temperature at dawn was 34 degrees above zero, warm enough that she cracked the entrance blanket to let fresh air inside, warm enough that Thomas went outside to relieve himself without his coat. By noon, the warmth had become unsettling. Nettie had lived on the plains long enough to know that January thaws didn't last. When the cold came back, it came back hard. She started sealing the dome at 1 o'clock. By 2, the wind had returned, not the steady blow of the previous weeks, but something different, something violent. A wall of white appeared on the northwestern horizon, advancing faster than any storm she had seen. The temperature began to drop. She had the entrance sealed by the time the storm hit. A blast of wind that shook the entire structure, that bent the willow poles and pressed the tumbleweed walls inward. The sound was like nothing she had heard before. Not a howl, but a shriek, a scream, a freight train roaring past at impossible speed. Thomas pressed against her, his face buried in her shoulder. She could feel him shaking. "It's all right," she said, though she didn't know if it was. "The walls will hold." The walls held, but the temperature didn't. She felt it happening, the cold seeping through the compressed tumbleweeds, through the dead air spaces that had protected them for months, through every gap and crack and thin spot that the brutal cold found and exploited. The interior temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 35 in the first hour, from 35 to 28 in the second, from 28 to 22 by nightfall. She lit the stove and burned hay as fast as she dared. The fire helped, pushed the temperature back up to 30 degrees, held it there while the wind screamed outside and the world turned white and the cold pressed in from every direction. But the hay was going fast. 3 bushels, 2, 1.5. At midnight, she heard someone at the entrance. It wasn't possible. No one could be outside in this storm. No one could survive even the walk from the Lindquist farm 3 miles away. The wind was blowing 60 miles an hour at least, the visibility 0, the temperature falling so fast that exposed skin froze in minutes. But someone was scratching at the entrance blanket. Someone was calling out, their voice barely audible over the wind. Nettie pulled the blanket aside and found Ingrid Lindquist collapsed in the snow. She was alone. Her coat was torn. Her face was white with frostbite. "Hjalmar," Ingrid gasped. "He went out to check the cattle. 3 hours ago. He hasn't come back." Nettie pulled her inside and sealed the entrance. Ingrid's hands were frozen, stiff and white, the fingers refusing to bend. Her feet were the same. She had walked 3 miles in the worst blizzard Nettie had ever seen to tell them her husband was missing. "He's dead," Ingrid said. Her voice was flat, matter of fact, as if she were reporting the weather. "I know he's dead. No one survives 3 hours in this, but I couldn't stay in the house alone. I couldn't." She broke off, shaking. Nettie wrapped her in blankets and put her by the stove. She thawed snow for water and made Ingrid drink it. She checked Thomas, who was awake and watching with wide eyes. "What do we do?" he asked. "We wait. We stay warm. We survive until morning." "And Mr. Lindquist?" Nettie didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. The storm continued through the night. The dome shook but didn't break. The temperature inside dropped to 19 degrees despite the fire. Ingrid's frostbitten hands began to hurt. A good sign, Nettie knew, because dead flesh didn't feel pain. But 3 of her fingers stayed white and numb. At dawn, the wind finally eased. Nettie dug out through 4 feet of drifted snow and looked at a world scoured clean. Nothing was visible except white, an endless expanse of white, unmarked by any feature she recognized. The windmill was buried. The fence posts had disappeared. The sky was pale and clear and utterly indifferent. She didn't look for Hjalmar Lindquist. She knew there was no point. They found his body 2 days later when the search party from Imperial finally reached the Lindquist farm. He had made it to within 200 feet of his barn. The cattle had survived. They had crowded together in a corner, sharing body heat, the way animals knew to do and humans often forgot. Hjalmar had died trying to reach them. He was 70 years old. He had survived 6 Nebraska winters. The 7th killed him. The storm that killed Hjalmar Lindquist killed 11 other people in Chase County alone. Across the plains, Nebraska, Kansas, Dakota Territory, Minnesota, the death toll climbed into the hundreds. The newspapers called it the Blizzard of '87. Old-timers called it the worst storm in living memory. Inside a dome built from tumbleweeds and chicken wire, Nettie Graydon and her brother Thomas waited out 3 days of killing cold. The interior temperature never rose above 22 degrees, but it never fell below 16. They burned the last of the hay on the 2nd day. After that, they survived the way Nettie had learned to survive: body heat, sealed entrance, the walls holding in every scrap of warmth their bodies could produce. On the 3rd day, when the temperature outside had stabilized at 4 degrees below zero and the wind had dropped to something survivable, Alma Paulson arrived with a sled full of supplies and tears freezing on her cheeks. "You're alive," she said. "We're alive." Alma looked at the dome, at the walls of compressed tumbleweeds, battered by the storm but intact, at the frost-covered interior, cold but not lethal. "The Hendersons lost their baby," she said. "Froze to death in their sod house. The roof collapsed under the snow, and they couldn't keep the heat in. The Mullers lost their grandmother. The Brauns lost 2 children and nearly lost a 3rd. She paused. "11 dead, that I know of. And you, in this thing built from weeds and wire, you survived." The dome held. The dome held. Alma shook her head slowly. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it. A tumbleweed igloo, a fire hazard made of pest plants, and it held through the worst storm in a decade." Nettie didn't say anything. She was too tired to explain, too cold to feel vindicated. She just stood there breathing, watching the white plume of her breath rise in the frozen air. She was alive. Thomas was alive. The dome had held. That was enough. That was everything. Word spread faster than the spring thaw. By February, 3 families had come to see the dome. By March, the number had reached a dozen. They walked through the entrance and stood in the dim interior, pressing their palms against the compressed tumbleweed walls the way Alma had done months before, the way Lindquist had done before the storm took him. "It's warm," they said, every one of them. "It shouldn't be warm, but it is." Nettie showed them how she had built it. The willow pole frame driven into the ground and bent inward, the double layer of chicken wire with tumbleweeds packed between, the mud seals at the joints, the extra banking around the base, the excavated floor that put the living space below ground level. She didn't charge for the information. She didn't have time to charge. She was too busy surviving, too focused on making it through to spring to think about profit. But she explained everything to anyone who asked, answered every question, drew diagrams in the dirt when words weren't enough. "It won't work for everyone," she said. "You need tumbleweeds, and lots of them. You need wire or something to hold them in place. You need to pack them tight, tighter than you think possible. And you need to seal every gap. The dead air does the work, but only if you keep it still." Some of them tried it. A homesteader named Erickson built a tumbleweed addition to his soddy that winter adding a 10-foot dome to the south side where the sun could warm it during the day. He claimed it cut his fuel consumption in half. A widow named Catherine Marsh built an entire structure, smaller than Nettie's, just big enough for herself, and survived the following winter with nothing but a tin heating stove and a fraction of the fuel her neighbors used. Others dismissed it. Ezra Coombs rode past the dome in late February, saw the crowd of curious settlers gathered outside, and kept riding without stopping. He never spoke to Nettie again. When his claim on her quarter section failed, the land office had recorded Alma's filing first. He sold his own land and moved to Colorado. She heard later that he had died there, alone, in a mining town whose name she never learned. Not everyone who tried the technique succeeded. A farmer in Ford County built a tumbleweed dome without packing the walls tightly enough and watched it collapse under the weight of an early spring snowfall. Another sealed his dome so thoroughly that the air inside grew stale and damp, breeding mold that ruined his stored food. The method worked, but it required understanding, the same careful attention to detail that had kept Nettie alive through the worst winter of her life. Alma Paulson adopted elements of the design for her own homestead. She banked tumbleweeds against the north wall of her sod house, creating an extra layer of insulation that she renewed each autumn. Her fuel consumption dropped by a third. Her chickens, housed in a small tumbleweed-insulated coop, survived temperatures that had killed every hen she'd owned the previous year. "I still think it looks ridiculous," Alma told Nettie that spring. "A house made of weeds. The fire hazard to end all fire hazards. But I can't argue with the results." "You don't have to argue with them," Nettie said. "You just have to stay warm." Nettie Graydon proved up her homestead claim in 1889, 2 years ahead of the typical 5-year requirement. The land office clerk noted that her improvements were unconventional but substantial, a phrasing that became a small legend in Chase County, repeated whenever someone attempted something that looked impossible and made it work anyway. She married a carpenter named Willem Osgood in 1891, a quiet man who had come to Nebraska from Michigan and stayed because he liked the silence. They built a proper frame house on her quarter section in 1893, using lumber hauled from the rail depot in Imperial, real lumber, milled and straight, nothing like the bent willow poles of her first home. But she kept the dome standing behind the new house, used it for storage, and occasionally for visitors who wanted to see what had kept her alive. Thomas Graydon stayed on the homestead until he was 16, then traveled east to attend school in Omaha. He became a teacher himself, a quiet man like his brother-in-law, comfortable with children, patient with their questions. He never returned to Chase County to live, but he visited every summer until Nettie's death in 1932. She was 61 years old, still living on the quarter section where she had nearly frozen, still pointing to the collapsed remains of the tumbleweed dome and explaining to anyone who would listen how dead air trapped between thorny branches had kept 2 children alive when grown men with proper houses had died. She was buried in the Imperial Cemetery next to Willem, who had preceded her by 4 years. Her headstone read only her name and dates, but the minister who spoke at her funeral mentioned the dome, mentioned the blizzard, mentioned the night Ingrid Lindquist had stumbled through a killing storm and found shelter in a structure that everyone had said would fail. She built something from nothing, the minister said, and when nothing was all she had, that was enough. On January the 12th, 1887, the temperature in Chase County, Nebraska, dropped 40 degrees in 4 hours. The wind reached 60 miles an hour. 11 people died. Hjalmar Lindquist, who had survived 6 Nebraska winters, had stood outside an abandoned dugout 5 months earlier and delivered his verdict on a 15-year-old girl with 43 cents and a 7-year-old brother. "A woman alone can't cut enough timber," he had said. "And there isn't timber to cut anyway. A girl alone, with a child, you'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." He was wrong. On the morning after the worst blizzard in a decade, Nettie Graydon dug out through 4 feet of snow, stood in the pale January light, and watched her breath rise in the frozen air. Behind her, the dome of compressed tumbleweed stood battered but unbroken. Inside, her brother slept under frost covered blankets in air that held at 16 degrees, cold, but not killing. Not even close. She had no timber. She had no money. She had nothing but a pest plant that everyone said was worthless and an idea that everyone said would fail. She was still standing. The wind had stopped. The sky was clear. And somewhere in the silence of that January morning, in a dome built from weeds and wire and stubborn refusal to die, a 15-year-old girl who had never built anything larger than a chicken coop had answered every doubt with the only argument that mattered. She was alive.